4 years after the invasion shattered Europe's sense of security, the Kremlin is no closer to victory. Ukraine is bruised, exhausted, undersupplied, but alive. And for Putin, that is the real crisis, because an undefeated Ukraine means his empire has limits, his power has limits, and time is running out. So he's turning to something far older and far darker than battlefield strategy. I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union. Today, we are going to trace the outlines of Putin's final plan, the one designed not to defeat Ukraine, but to divide it, redefine it, and make the world complicit in the process. Here's our roadmap for this investigation. Putin's dead end. Why Russia can't win, and why that is far more dangerous than defeat. Erasing a country. The ideology that denies Ukraine's right to exist. Trump's peace. Why this plan is a gift to the Kremlin. Their slice of the pie. The European actors quietly enabling Putin's scenario. If partition happens, the consequences for Ukraine, Europe, and the global order. Before we begin, a quick invitation. Independent analysis survives only because of you. If this work matters to you, consider subscribing, sharing, or supporting through PayPal, Superthanks, or Think Tank. So conversations like this can continue without permission. Putin's dead end. 4 years into the full-scale invasion, Putin's got a real problem. In his general's reports, Russia is advancing. In reality, the war looks like a meat grinder that never ends and never gives him the victory he wanted. Look at the front line. Russia now controls around a fifth of Ukraine's territory, including Crimea and big chunks of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson regions. It's still pushing forward near cities like Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. But every kilometer costs thousands of soldiers and mountains of equipment. And these tiny gains don't change the bigger picture. Ukraine is still fighting. The state is still alive. The army is still in the field. Yes, Ukraine needs outside help to keep going. But that help keeps coming. And Russia needs to throw more people, more shells, more drones into the line just to move a few miles. Now, look at the long game. Ukrainians' path is painful but clear. It survives as a state. It becomes a fortress of Europe. It's easier and cheaper for Europe to arm Ukraine than to fight Russia on its own territory. Russia's path is the opposite. Yes, GDP numbers look better than many expected, but most of this growth comes from war spending, while civilian industries are suffocating. The interest rate is prohibitively high at 18%. That means no cheap lending for businesses. The taxes are bumped up every few months. Businesses respond by raising prices. That means ordinary Russians can afford to buy even fewer goods than before, and consumer markets are spiraling downwards. At the same time, the country is shrinking and aging. Births in 2024 hit the lowest level in more than 20 years. The decline was almost as severe as the World War II era shock. After that, the state stopped publishing the figures. Inside the country, the regime has dropped even the pretense of normal life. New laws on treason, fake news, and foreign agents turn any criticism of the war into a crime. And here is the dead end. If Putin accepts any peace that leaves Ukraine alive and armed, he knows what happens next. Ukraine will rearm, trade, rebuild its economy with Western help, and wait for its chance to take everything back. In a decade, Russia will be poorer, older, more isolated, and facing a stronger enemy on the same border. This is why he won't be happy to just freeze the front line and get to keep the land he already grabbed. To feel safe, he needs something else. A future where Ukraine as a state doesn't exist at all. Erasing a country. If you listen to Russian officials, you notice one thing. In their world, Ukraine barely exists. It's not a neighbor. It's not a separate people. It's a mistake on the map. Putin has been repeating this for years. In his big 2021 essay on the unity of Russians and Ukrainians, he wrote that they are one people and that there is no historical basis for separate Ukrainian nation. That text is an obvious example of propaganda and pseudo-history. But inside Russia, it's treated almost like a sacred document. Soldiers are ordered to study it. State TV quotes it as truth. Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, goes even further. On his Telegram channel, he calls Ukraine not a country, but artificially collected territories. He says Ukrainian is not a language, but a mongrel dialect of Russian. In 2024, he wrote that any Ukraine in any form is mortally dangerous and should not exist at all. That is not a fringe opinion. He is a deputy chairman of the Security Council of Russia and the chairman of the United Russia, the ruling political party, and a loudspeaker for the regime. From this point of view, there is nothing to negotiate. You can bargain over the existence of your own historical territories. That is why Putin now calmly says at economic forums that the whole of Ukraine is ours in theory and hints that Russian troops can walk into new regions like Sumy whenever he wants more security. This story is hammered into people every day, and the propaganda version, Kievan Rus, is simply ancient Russia. Ukrainians are little Russians, and every attempt at independence is a Nazi plot run by the West. Serious historians call this nonsense. But truth is not the point here. The point is to make the average viewer feel that no Ukrainian state has the right to exist. At the same time, there is deep suspicion toward Ukrainians even on the pro-Russian side. Collaborators from occupied territories who escaped to Moscow complain that patriotic audiences still treat them as second class. You are not fully ours, and never will be. Inside Russia, the state attacks anything that smells like sympathy for Ukraine. Courts now hand out double-digit prison terms for donations to Ukrainian forces or even Ukrainian refugees. A military court in Belgrade gave activist Nadezhda Rosinskaya 22 years for helping refugees and allegedly aiding Ukraine's army. Occupation courts in Crimea and Zaporizhia had out 12 to 14 year sentences for tiny online transfers. You don't even need to send money. You can get in trouble for colors. A woman in Moscow was fined for yellow and blue hat and a heart in the colors of Ukraine. Another man was detained and fined because his sneakers were blue and yellow. The police wrote that his shoes were a means of agitation. Dozens of people were punished for clothes, hair dye, manicures, or fences painted in those two colors. This is not just paranoia. It is policy. If Ukraine is not a real country, then any trace of Ukrainian identity inside Russia becomes a threat. Now, link this back to peace. If you have spent years telling your own people that Ukraine is a mistake, that any Ukraine is mortally dangerous for Russia, then what does a good peace look like? Any agreement that leaves a Ukraine state on the map with its own army means the central problem, as they see it, is unsolved. Trump's peace. Putin's immediate goal is simple: stop the US from arming Ukraine. No more long-range missiles that hit deep into occupied territory and Russia itself. Then, ideally, slow down or freeze weapons deliveries to Europe, even the ones paid for in full. That's what the Kremlin needs endless peace talks for. They say they want peace in Ukraine, but keep striking its cities every day, killing more civilians. They beefed up military spending in the next year's budget. The talk is merely a distraction. Donald Trump bought this trick. When running for presidency, he sold a simple story that he could end the war in 24 hours. He repeated that line so often, it became a slogan. When pressed, he says he'll speak to one, speak to the other, and cut a quick deal to stop people dying. It sounds humane on TV. In practice, his 28-point plan is built on forcing Ukraine to give up more land, cap its army, and promise never to join NATO. That's surrender, packaged as a peace plan. And this plan has Russian fingerprints all over it. It's based on a list of Moscow's conditions that was passed to Trump's team in October. Next, Jared Kushner and Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff worked on the text with Kirill Dmitriev, the head of a Russian sovereign fund and Putin's close confidant. The plan's core points: shrinking Ukraine's army, giving up parts of Donbass, shelving NATO membership, copy Moscow's demands almost one-to-one. The moral problem here is obvious. If you design a peace where Ukraine loses territory and Russia keeps its gains, what are you telling the world? You're saying that borders are for sale. That the line between aggression and business is just a matter of good PR. But there is also a cold practical problem. Some in Washington clearly think they can feed Ukraine to Putin, then slowly grind Russia down with sanctions until it becomes weak. The example these people like to cite is Iran. A once rich oil state is now stuck with high inflation, power cuts, and a shrinking economy. That happened thanks to sanctions plus corruption and mismanagement. Except Iran is not a quiet, fenced-off exhibit. It is a constant source of crisis. Proxy wars, missile strikes, refugee flows. Sanctions didn't turn it into a friendly neighbor. They turned it into a heavily armed, angry, unstable regime that keeps testing how far it can go. Apply this to Russia. A contained Russia sitting on a stolen Ukrainian land is not a tame animal. It has nukes, an imperial ideology, and zero respect for treaties. It will spend every year looking for ways to break the cage. Many cite another reason to give Putin what he wants. Yes, it's tough on everyone, it's really unfair on Ukraine, but we can't risk a nuclear war. But they are making a big mistake. When Putin feels cornered, he flashes nukes as his strongest ace. He and his close circle threaten World War III and total destruction of the West. In reality, that's never going to happen. If they cross that line, they'll lose everything. Their power, their money, their families. They know it, and they are not half as deranged as to do that. But many in the West still take this nuclear blackmail seriously, just to err on the safe side. Apart from empty threats, there's very real money on the table. The US and EU are each other's biggest trading partners. They buy and sell a worth of about $1.5 trillion per year. That makes up to 20% of each one's total foreign trade. If Europe ends up poorer, over-militarized, and permanently nervous because of a rotten peace in Ukraine, that will hit American exporters and jobs. So when Washington toys with the idea of sacrificing Ukraine land to get a quick win, it's not only betraying its own talk about democracy. It is also building a future where its main ally, Europe, becomes weaker and more dependent on American weapons instead of being a rich partner that buys American goods. Right now, Trump's plan faces resistance in Kiev and in major European capitals. Zelensky is publicly refusing to give up land. EU leaders are pushing their own ideas for using frozen Russian assets to keep Ukraine fighting. However, not everyone in the EU is on the same page. Some governments are openly siding with Putin. Their slice of the pie. Putin doesn't have enough strength to swallow all of Ukraine, so he needs partners, not just silent bystanders, but willing accomplices. As their reward, they'll get cheap gas and oil, and possibly their own slice of Ukrainian land. In Europe, the main candidates for that role are right next door to Ukraine. Hungary and Slovakia are formally in the EU and NATO, but in practice, they act as brakes on almost every serious step to support Kiev. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has been playing this game for years. He vetoed EU aid packages, blocked joint conclusions on military support. Now he says openly that financing Ukraine's war effort will ruin Europe. He pushes Trump's peace talks, warns that Brussels is pro-war. At the same time, he deepens Hungary's dependence on Russian gas through new deals. Around him grows a smaller, louder fringe. Hungary's far-right Our Homeland Party has said that if Ukraine loses its statehood, they will demand Ukraine's Zakarpattia region for Hungary. That region used to belong to Hungary for almost 1,000 years. For people in Zakarpattia, where ethnic Hungarians live next to Ukrainians and Romanians, this is not some far-fetched talk. For years, Orban has poured money into the region. He handed out Hungarian passports and demanded more autonomy for his compatriots. That's a watered-down version of the script Moscow followed in Crimea and Donbass. You prepare a minority question today so you can use it tomorrow as a reason to protect someone with tanks. At the same time, Robert Fico in Slovakia has stopped state arms deliveries to Ukraine. He repeats that the war cannot be solved militarily. His government attacks EU sanctions as hurting Europe more than Russia. So far, Slovakia has not claimed any piece of Ukrainian land, but the country critically depends on Russian oil. What about other neighbors who could possibly cut into Ukrainian territory? Romania is actually moving in the opposite direction. It signed a security agreement with Ukraine, increased Black Sea cooperation, and even passed laws to take over Russian energy assets like Lukoil. Bucharest sees Russia as a long-term threat, not a partner for splitting someone else's land. Poland had its own quarrels with Kiev over grain trade and weapons deliveries. But despite that, it stands firmly pro-Ukraine and anti-Kremlin. Although Poland historically owned large swaths of land in West Ukraine, it is not siding with Putin to demand them back. But the Kremlin still uses this bit of history for propaganda. State TV keeps pushing the story about Poland quietly preparing to take over West Ukraine. This is laughed off by people in Ukraine and Europe, but still believed by some Russians. The official stance of the European Union remains unchanged. Ukraine's sovereignty and independence are non-negotiable. Any peace must respect its borders and security. European leaders often link Ukraine's survival directly to the security of the whole Union. So the partition lobby inside Europe is a small minority, but for Putin, it is a very valuable minority. Because if one day Kiev is weak and Western capitals are tired, he only needs a few voices whispering, "These borders were never real anyway." If partition happens. In Putin's best-case scenario, The war ends with a conference table where he sits with the US and EU leaders. On the map in front of them, Ukraine is a smaller shape. The signatures at the bottom are not only Russian, they are Western too. The Trump peace plan already moves in this direction. It expects Ukraine to give up parts of Donbass. In return, it gets frozen Russian assets as reconstruction money. On paper, it sounds like justice. Russia pays. In practice, it is a tool to push Ukraine into a deal it doesn't want. International lawyers are already warning about this. If a country under attack signs a treaty that gives away territory because its allies will cut support otherwise, is that a free choice or a deal under duress? Several legal analyses argue that any peace confirmed Russia's land grab would be defective. It would reward aggression. It could be challenged later as invalid. And Putin could treat it as a joke. You signed it? I got the land. Good luck in your courts. Imagine this peace plan becomes reality. Ukraine is cut in pieces. Russia holds what it grabbed. Maybe some bordering states gets a quiet sphere of influence over a region with its minorities. Officially, Europe celebrates the end of war. In reality, defense spending keeps climbing as Russia keeps probing borders with hybrid attacks and nuclear threats. On the ground, a family in a cut-off Ukrainian town will live through something more brutal. One day, they wake up and find that the border moved past their window. Their relatives are on the other side. Their bank cards stop working. One child studies a Ukrainian curriculum online. Another is told in a new local school that this has always been Russian land or someone else's historical province. What does peace even mean in a situation like that? For Putin, it means time. Time to digest the pieces he got. Time to turn occupied territories into militarized zones. Time to rebuild his army and prepare to start a new war. And we all end up in a world where borders are negotiable, where aggression pays, where words like sovereignty and rule-based order mean nothing. So we'll face more violent conflicts all over the globe. More strong countries invading their weaker neighbors to press them into compliance. What if this partition script fails? Then there is no fast happy ending either. Ukraine keeps fighting, Russia keeps bleeding resources and people, Europe keeps paying more for defense, but in that harder future, one thing stays intact. The idea that you do not get to erase a country just because you have nukes. That is the real choice facing Western elites now. Not war or peace, but what kind of future they are willing to sign their names under. So I want to ask you directly, would you personally accept a peace that cuts Ukraine into pieces if it promised a calmer news cycle and slightly cheaper gas? Or do you believe the line must hold, even if the struggle lasts longer and even if it costs more? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to hear how you see this moment. If this conversation helped you understand the stakes more clearly, please consider supporting this work. Through a like, a share, a subscription, a think tank membership, or even a small gesture from PayPal or SuperThanks. Your support keeps this channel alive, independent, unfiltered, and answerable only to you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for caring enough to ask the hardest questions with me.